Um, we are in the midst of a series of messages on the I ams of Christ. And as we have looked through these different topics, we find that they're all in the Gospel of John, and that there are 8 times in the Gospel of John where Jesus distinctly says something about who he is, and he uses the phrase, I am. It's not I was, it's not I will be, but it is I am. And these phrases, these statements of Jesus, all deal directly with our relationship to him. This morning, we're going to be in John chapter 10. Now, we were there last week, and I told you last week as we looked at Jesus calling himself the gate to the sheepfold or the door, that he also called himself the Good Shepherd, and that the two were kind of running parallel with each other in Jesus' discussion with the Pharisees in John chapter 10. And I told you that today we would be looking more at the side of what he said about himself being the Good Shepherd. And so we are looking at this aspect of Christ and who he is. He is not a good shepherd. He is the Good Shepherd. And that's so important for us to understand. This is the 6th in our series of the I ams of Jesus. Lynn Anderson wrote some books a few years back. He wrote one volume that became a bestseller called They Smell Like Sheep. Now, what smells like sheep? Sheep smell like sheep, certainly. But the book is about shepherds. And it says, and his premise is that shepherds spend so much time with the flock that even the shepherds start smelling like sheep. And if anyone has been around a flock of sheep, you know what Lynn Anderson's talking about. A few years ago, he had the opportunity to be the featured speaker at Johnson University for their homecoming. And we were in attendance, and the gentleman who introduced Lynn Anderson told us about who he was and what he had accomplished and how this had become a best-selling book and an important book to deal with when we're looking at shepherding within the church. And then he said, and Lynn Anderson has a sequel out. He has They Smell Like Sheep #2. Which Lynn Anderson had to get up and correct. He said that's part 2, not number 2. But it makes sense. Sheep stink. They really stink. Now, some years ago in this book, he tells the story of how he and his wife, Carolyn, were on a bus tour through Israel. And I know exactly what he was experiencing because I also was privileged and blessed to be able to visit the Holy Land back in 1999. And I was on a bus tour. He said as they went through the Israeli countryside, they came upon Bedouin shepherds. Now, the Bedouins is a group of folks that live there that still abide by the old ways. And they still shepherd the flocks. They watch over them. They care for them. They do it pretty much the way it was done in biblical times. In fact, Bedouins will be wearing robes and sandals. And it's almost like you're transformed and you're suddenly in a different era of history. There is one exception. I saw a few cell phones strapped to their waists. So, they do enjoy and do get themselves involved with the 21st century. And back then, 1999 was still the end of the 20th. But what Lynn said was that his tour guide was explaining how a shepherd knows the sheep and how the sheep love the shepherd. He said the shepherd builds a relationship with the sheep. He feeds them. He gently cares for them. He pointed out that a shepherd will never drive the sheep, but a shepherd will always lead the sheep. And the sheep will follow because he's not harsh. And because they hear his voice. And they know him. And they trust him. And so there's just some wonderful things that he said are compared, that we can compare the shepherding that still goes on in Israel with what God does for his people. But then he went on to say, he said, there was one year when I was explaining this same thing to a busload of tourists, and I realized I had lost their attention. Every one of them was looking out the window. Every one of them was looking in the same direction. And as he stopped talking, he stooped down and he looked out the window too, and he realized what they were seeing. They were watching a man who was chasing a herd of sheep. They were watching a man who was throwing rocks at them. He was whacking the sheep with sticks. He was sicking his sheepdogs on them. He was yelling. He was throwing tantrums. And it irritated this tour guide so much that he ordered the bus driver to stop. He ran out to this guy who was doing everything the opposite as far as what he had just been explaining. And he said, "You know what you've just done to me? I was telling this charming story to our tourists about the gentle way of shepherds, and here you are mistreating and assaulting these sheep. What is going on?" And for a moment, there was a bewildered look on the man's face. And then the light dawned. And he said, "Oh, man," he said, "you've got me all wrong. I'm not a shepherd. I'm the butcher." And he was driving the sheep to market. He was taking them someplace they did not want to go. This is what a good shepherd is not. He's not one who is going to drive. He's not one who's going to force. He's not one who is going to chastise. He's not one who is going to whip and beat into submission. But a good shepherd will care for his sheep. Some animals must be driven, and they don't have a very good life when the person who is driving them is forcing things upon them. But then there are other animals that can be led, because they have a relationship with the shepherd. They hear his voice. They follow him. They trust him implicitly. Now, some people in charge of flocks are actually bringing them harm, and other people are gentle shepherds. I want you to understand something this morning. Jesus is the good shepherd. He is not a good shepherd, but he is the good shepherd, and he knows what we need. He leads, we follow. Do you realize that the Bible mentions this relationship of God with his people and compares that relationship to sheep and shepherding and flocks about 220 times all the way through the Old Testament and the New Testament? Over and over again, God's people are called the flock of God, the sheep, the lost lambs. Over and over again, we are compared to sheep. Now, that might not settle well with us if we really knew a little bit more about sheep. There are some unflattering characteristics of sheep. There are some problems that we have with sheep. First of all, sheep are stupid and sheep are stubborn. Have you ever seen a trained sheep? Have you ever gone to a circus and watched all the trained animals and watch a sheep do an act? No. You won't see that. You'll see dancing elephants, you'll see monkeys, you'll see dogs, but you won't see a trained sheep, because a sheep is simple-minded. I had a couple of cousins who lived on the south edge of Akron, Ohio, and that's where they spent most all of their elementary and middle school and high school years. And they lived in a farmhouse, and they had a little bit of acreage, and there was still a small barn there, but the urban sprawl was coming toward them, and that rural area was being developed. Even every time I went there were new houses being built around them. But they still had a little bit of a mini farm going on, and they had a sheep. They had a sheep that they loved so much that they designed a harness for that sheep, and they would walk the sheep down the city sidewalks like you and I would walk a dog. Well, eventually, the city of Akron said no more farm animals are to live within city limits, and they had to find a home for that sheep to spend his final years. But they're simple-hearted, and they are hard to train. That was unusual that sheep was willing to walk with them much like a dog would with his master. Sheep are not only stupid and stubborn, they are dirty, and they are wayward. They wander off. They're not like the Serta sheep we see in the commercials of the idea of counting 100 sheep in order to fall asleep, and the Serta sheep always being upset because these mattresses are better than we are as far as getting people to sleep. They're not cute and warm and fuzzy. They easily wander off, and they never learn from their mistakes. When we were living for 12 years in southern Indiana, when we were ministering down there in a rural church, we were on property, the church building was on property that was surrounded on three sides by the largest sheep farm in the state of Indiana. And I'll tell you, sometimes coming to church and seeing the sheep grazing on these rolling hills around the church building was just real encouraging, until the wind blew the wrong direction. And when the wind blew the wrong direction on a Sunday morning, we could have all of our windows shut, we could have all of the air conditioning cranked up, and the smell would still permeate the building. Sheep stink. Now, the Bertrams, who ran the farm, were members of the church. And on more than one occasion, Wayne, the son of the man who actually owned the flocks and had charge of the farm, would bring a lamb to the church for a special occasion. When we needed to talk about Passover, he brought a lamb. When there was a vacation Bible school story, he brought a lamb. I can guarantee he didn't just pick it up out of the field and bring it in. He washed it and he bathed it and he made sure it was halfway presentable. There was still that telltale odor, though, because it was a sheep. And so they're stupid, they're stubborn, they're dirty, they're wayward, they're easily frightened, and they're confused. Sheep are known to plunge off of cliffs because of their fear and because of their confusion. They are defenseless and they are dependent. They need guidance and they need protection. Let me tell you about a particular sheep in Georgia by the name of Rocky. Let's see that picture. There's Rocky. Rocky was part of a family farm down in Georgia, and Rocky was the type of sheep that I just described. As much as he was loved, he was stupid, he was stubborn, he was dirty, he was wayward, he was frightened, he was confused, he was defenseless, he was dependent, and he needed guidance. Rocky loved to find dirt, and he would roll in it. He loved to find urine, and he would roll in it. He loved to find manure, and he would roll in it. And Rocky eventually had a coat of wool that was much heavier than it ever should have been, that was home for all sorts of vermin and insects and disease-laden items that could affect his health. He didn't know any better. It's what he wanted to do. It's who he was. He was the epitome of all these descriptions of a sheep in need. And he could not save himself. He couldn't go to the barber and say, I want a short clip this time, please. He couldn't do that. He needed help, and he had no means of helping himself. He needed a loving shepherd to save him from the mess he was in, and so do we. So do we. Because we're dirty and we're simple-hearted and we get ourselves in trouble and we fall off cliffs and we injure ourselves, and we need a shepherd. We need someone who's caring for us, someone who's watching over us, someone who is going to look out for us like Rocky's shepherds looked out for him and finally decided it's time to help this poor guy. There are some loving characteristics of a shepherd that we need to talk about. And in order to talk about those loving characteristics, I want us to turn again to Psalm 23. Now, I know that we were there last week, but I want us to go there again. Because in Psalm 23, we have this wonderful analogy of who a shepherd is. A shepherd is one who cares for his flock. He is one who feeds and nurtures. Psalm 23, written by David, who was a shepherd, grew up in a shepherd's family, understood the need of the flock, and he relayed that to himself. And he said, even though I'm a shepherd to these sheep, God is a shepherd to me. And in Psalm 23, he let us know that God provides. He knows our basic needs. He said, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. I have basic needs in my life. I need to be able to rest when it's time to rest. And I need to know that I can rest in safety. And my shepherd will make sure that I'm resting and resting well. I have basic needs in my life. I need to be able to drink and to eat. And he will bring me to good pasture. He will let me drink at quiet waters. He restores and calms my soul. And so this good shepherd provides. He knows our basic needs. But this good shepherd also pilots. He knows our need for direction. If you go on and see what else David said, he said, he guides me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. He is the one who pilots us and steers us on the straight path. It shows us the direction we need to go. And so the Good Shepherd will provide. The Good Shepherd will pilot. But he also protects. Look again at what David said. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. He protects us. Two items the shepherd carries at all times. He carries the rod to be able to defend himself and the flock from enemies. It's the rod that he uses to beat off the wolf when the wolf comes to attack. It's the rod that he uses to prod at the bear and make the bear turn around and decide he's no match for this little shepherd boy and his bravery. No, he better move on. The rod protects the flock and keeps the enemy away. The staff is for the sheep. There are times the sheep are going to go the wrong direction. They're going to be doing the wrong thing. And the staff is to correct them and bring them back in. And so God guides through our needs, both with a rod and with the staff. But he also pursues. He knows our need for compassion. It says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. These are the loving characteristics of a good shepherd. But I want you to understand that Jesus is so much more than a good shepherd. Jesus is the good shepherd. Let's take a look at this next slide. There's some of Rocky's filth. Rocky didn't know that he was endangering his life. He didn't know that in 90-plus degree temperatures in Georgia, that amount of wool combined with the pounds of dirt that had accumulated in the wool could kill him, could cause heat stroke. But his shepherds knew, and that's just one handful of the muck and the dirt and the mess that they were able to shear off of Rocky's fur. Rocky was a filthy animal that needed a shepherd. And it was the loving characteristic of his shepherd that took time to convince him that he needed to trust them. Rocky didn't want to do it at first. He wanted to run. It took two men, two grown, strong men, to be able to corral that sheep and to get him to the point where he would submit to them and lie on his back. Once the sheep's on his back, he is defenseless. And then they started using the clippers, and they started removing the garbage that was endangering Rocky's life. That's what Jesus does. He provides and he pilots, he protects, he pursues. And although Rocky was not sure what his shepherds were doing, he trusted them. We need to do the same thing. When things are going on in our lives and spiritually, we see it seems like somehow there's a reprimand or somehow there's a sense of guidance from God and we're not sure what to think of it. We need to trust the Lord because he knows better than we what we need. And so there are some loving characteristics of a shepherd, but ultimately Jesus is the good shepherd. What makes Jesus different from all other shepherds? Well, let's go to John chapter 10. We were there last week, and we were looking at how Jesus was the gate in John chapter 10. This morning I want to start at verse 11, and I want to read down through verse 18. John chapter 10, verses 11 through 18. Jesus had just said that he was the gate for the sheep. He had just said he was the door for people to go in and come out, to find good pasture, to be able to rest. And he was the one who was going to protect the flock from enemies, because you only go through the door. If you try to climb over the wall, you're a thief and a robber and you don't belong. And so Jesus was saying he was the only way in and the only means of safety. And then he says this. In John 10, verse 11, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and he runs away. And then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. Divided the people again. His words were upsetting people. Not everyone liked what Jesus said. Not everyone wanted to follow Jesus, or they wanted to believe what he was saying. But when he said things like this, and he compared himself with God the shepherd, and said he was equal to God in so many ways, it bothered a lot of people. And Jesus is the good shepherd. He is a good shepherd because he has a goodness about him. He didn't say, I am a shepherd, or I am a good shepherd. He is the good shepherd. In Psalm 34, verse 8, it says, "Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good." And Jesus used the same wordage here. The goodness of God is the goodness of Jesus. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. Jesus is good. And Jesus is committed. A committed shepherd is going to be one who lays down his life for the sheep. In Philippians chapter 2, Paul said this, Jesus, being in the very form of God, emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant and being made in the likeness of man. In other words, God became human. And being human, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Jesus has given up everything he had in order to be our good shepherd. And by his sacrifice, he opens the doors of heaven to us all. A good shepherd is courageous. Jesus said here in this passage that a hired hand is going to run when the wolf comes, but a shepherd is going to stand by the flock because a shepherd is going to be there to protect the flock. There's a lot of things that people do for the mighty dollar. We've just finished our NFL season. Just last week as there was a Super Bowl. And as we watched that, we watched some new rules that had come into play on protecting the quarterback from nearly lethal hits. But I can tell you that when men are young and they're offered thousands upon thousands of dollars just to play in one game, they're going to be willing to take the hits. And I can tell you that many of those same players have jeopardized their health, and they have jeopardized their families, and they have jeopardized their futures for something they can never take to heaven. You can't take a Super Bowl ring to heaven. You can't take a playoff berth to heaven. They did it for money. But here's the promise in Hebrews 5. Jesus says, I'll never forsake you. I'll never leave you. He is so concerned for us and for our eternity, he will be there. And we need to understand that. He is the courageous one who will not abandon us in a time, and he doesn't compromise on what he's teaching. Jesus is a man of knowledge. He said, I'm the good shepherd, and I know the sheep, and the sheep know me. We're really pretty foolish people. We think we can get away with things. We've become good at playing the game of life. Some say that they love Jesus, and yet they don't love the people Jesus loves. Some say they follow Jesus, but they go places where Jesus would never go. Some people display holiness on the outside, but on the inside they know they're foolish. On the inside they know they're phony. And we might fool people, but we're not fooling God. We're not fooling Christ. He is the shepherd who knows us. And we can know him. We can know him. He has a devotion. He has an openness. He has a sense of oneness, of singleness, of purpose and mind and unity. I need to tell you something. First Church of Christ in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan is not the only body of believers in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. Nor are the churches or the people we rub elbows with, people who look like us and sing like us and have Sunday worship like us, are they the only Christians? There are people all over the world who wear different clothes, who have different dialects, who have different skin colors, who worship in different forms that belong to the body of Christ. And Jesus said, these are all my sheep. And so we need to take a look and see a broader view of who the church is. It's so much more than the microscopic view we can take sometimes of our own congregation and our own people. Jesus has authority. He said, I can lay down my life because I can pick it up again. No one takes it from me. It's mine to do. And I love the sheep so much that I will lay down my life for them, but no one can keep me down. I received this from my Father. Wow. To me, that's amazing. One more shot of Rocky. This is Rocky after. Looks a little lighter, doesn't he? A little more comfortable, a little more air-conditioned. Can you imagine being in oppressive 90-plus degree heat in Georgia, wearing all that poundage of fur and dirt and filth and vile things right next to his skin? Can you imagine how much more comfortable Rocky is now because he submitted himself to his shepherds and they removed the junk? That's what Jesus does. He knows better than we about the garbage we carry in our lives that we think is just fine and dandy, and he removes it. We don't need to carry the garbage and the weight of sin around, things that can destroy our lives, because Jesus is not only the Good Shepherd, Jesus is our Good Shepherd. He said this, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for his friends. And you are my friends if you do what I ask." Folks, we can leave the filth behind. That's what came off of Rocky. That's what he was carrying unnecessarily. That's what he could not remove by himself. He needed his shepherd. He needed the gentle and the caring and sometimes the firm touch of the people who loved him and knew better than he what he needed in his life. Why in the world would we want to carry that around with us? When we can be relieved of the burden, we can leave the filth behind. Gentle shepherd, come and lead us, for we need you to help us find our way. Gentle shepherd, come and feed us, for we need your strength from day to day. There's no other we can turn to who can help us face another day. Gentle shepherd, come and lead us, for we need you to help us find our way. Last slide. Just leave that up. There he is. And there's where we need to be. That's where we need to be, following Jesus Christ. Trusting him implicitly. Knowing that he knows better than we what we need in our lives. Not second-guessing him or what he has commanded in his word. Not trying to rewrite the scriptures, but following him and letting him be Lord of our lives. He is the gentle shepherd, and he wants to be your gentle shepherd. This morning, if you are outside of Jesus Christ, if you don't know someone who you can follow, we invite you to come to Jesus and follow him. And let him lead you to those gentle and still waters, to that green pasture. Let him restore your soul. And if that's a big hole in your life right now, you can fill it today by coming forward as we sing this song and identifying Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior and making a commitment to follow him by being baptized into Christ, by being filled with his Spirit. There won't be a hole. There will be a shepherd. And you'll just be one of the flock who can trust the Lord. We need that, folks, and we need it today. And if you're ready for that kind of relationship that is eternal, I can invite you today to come to Jesus Christ. Would you do that? Would you find in him rest for your souls? You can do that today. And you can come forward as we stand and as we sing this song. Let's stand together.